The envelope was cream-colored, sealed with the same wax stamp our family had used on every official document since before I was born, and my mother handed it to the officiant like she was passing him a ring instead of a weapon. My name is Maren. I'm 41, I own a bistro called Thistle and Rye in Savannah, and until the second Saturday of October, I believed, the way you believe things you've simply never had reason to question, that I was still, in some fundamental sense, my mother's daughter, entitled to whatever that word had always meant in our family. I stood in a wedding tent strung with cafe lights, watching my younger sister Kendall marry a man named Grant Calloway, and I had no idea that in about 4 minutes, my mother was going to stand up during the toasts and hand a stranger in a collared shirt a document with my name struck through it, in front of 140 guests. I'd flown in from Savannah 2 days earlier with my 15-year-old daughter, Poppy, and spent an entire afternoon untangling a seating chart disaster for Kendall's wedding planner, the way I'd untangled every family crisis for as long as I could remember. That was, in a sense, my whole role in this family. The fixer. The one who drove 3 hours when Mom's water heater broke. The one who mediated between Kendall and our brother Todd every Thanksgiving. The one who'd quietly co-signed a business loan for the family furniture company 8 years earlier when cash flow got tight, no questions asked, because that's what you did for people who loved you. My mother, Diane, is 68, and she has run Wexler Home Furnishings, the company my grandfather started, the company my father Arthur built into something real before he died 6 years ago, with the specific, unbending competence of a woman who has never once doubted her own judgment. Grant's family owned Callaway Capital, an investment firm that had, over the past year, begun quietly merging with Wexler. I hadn't paid the merger much attention. I had my own restaurant to run, 300 miles away, and I'd assumed, the way I assumed most things about my family, that whatever was happening with the company trust was none of my concern anymore. I'd left the family business at 26 to open my own place. I thought that had made me independent. I didn't yet understand it had also made me, in my mother's eyes, expendable. The toast started around 9. Todd went first, brief and slightly too loud, 3 glasses of bourbon into the evening, the way Todd always got at family events, present in body, absent in judgment. Then my mother stood, tapped her glass, and began a speech about legacy and continuity that I assumed, in the moment, was simply about Kendall and Grant's marriage, about 2 families merging into something larger. It wasn't only that. And by the time she finished it, handing that cream-colored envelope to the officiant with a smile I'd know anywhere, the smile she used when she'd already made a decision and was simply informing the room of it, not asking anyone's permission, I understood that whatever was inside concerned me directly, and that I was about to find out, in front of 140 people including my own daughter, exactly how much my mother's love had always come with conditions I'd never once bothered to read. I remember reaching for Poppy's hand under the table before I even understood why. Some part of me had already known, in the 2 or 3 seconds it took the officiant to unfold that paper, that whatever came next would divide my life cleanly into a before and an after. I want to back up, because the wedding wasn't really where this started. It only felt that way, standing in that tent. The truth is the story had been building for over a year, in details I noticed and set down without examining, the way you set down anything too heavy to carry while you're also carrying everything else. It started, if I'm honest, the previous spring, when my mother called to tell me Wexler was exploring a strategic partnership with Callaway Capital. She used that phrase, strategic partnership, with the careful precision she used for anything she'd already decided and simply hadn't finished explaining yet. I asked if this affected the family trust, the one my grandfather had set up decades ago, the one that had always, as far as I knew, treated the 3 of us kids equally. She said it was complicated, and changed the subject to Poppy's school schedule, and I let her change it, because arguing with my mother about money had never once, in 41 years, ended in my favor, and some part of me had learned long ago that peace was cheaper than winning. That same spring, Neil Ashford, our family's attorney for as long as I could remember, and, if I'm being fully honest, someone I'd dated briefly in my 20s before he married someone else and settled into being the Wexler family's most trusted advisor, started being unusually hard to reach. I called him twice about an unrelated matter, a small property question involving my father's estate, and both times he took days to call back, apologizing vaguely about being buried in the merger paperwork. I noticed the delay. I told myself lawyers are busy people, that it meant nothing, that Neil had never once given me a reason to doubt him in 20 years of knowing him. Kendall, that summer, started talking about the wedding in a way that felt subtly different from how she'd talked about anything before, more expansive, more assured, dropping details about a venue, a guest list, a budget that seemed, even accounting for the Calloway family's money, larger than made sense for a 36-year-old marketing director marrying into new wealth. I complimented the venue when she showed me photos. I didn't ask where the money was actually coming from. That question sat in me anyway, unasked, the way most of my questions that year sat in me instead of coming out of my mouth. I want to stop here for a second. Because if you've ever kept your whole life running smoothly while some quiet, unexamined feeling sat underneath it, unnamed, you already understand exactly what that spring and summer felt like for me. I was managing my restaurant's cash flow, managing Poppy's transition into high school, managing my mother's mounting expectations for the wedding, and somewhere beneath all that competent managing, a low unease had started that I didn't yet have language for, and didn't have the time, or frankly the courage, to sit still long enough to name. My own restaurant, that summer, hit a rough patch, a kitchen fire in June that closed thistle and rye for 6 weeks, insurance delays, a rebuild that cost more than the payout covered. I mentioned it to my mother once, carefully, hoping without quite admitting it to myself that she might offer help the way the family always had before. She said she was sure I'd figure it out, the way I always did, and asked if I'd confirmed my flight for the wedding yet. I remember the specific, small coldness of that non-answer settling into my chest, and I remember telling myself it didn't mean anything, that she was simply distracted by wedding planning, that I was reading too much into a single conversation. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. My best friend and business partner, Sasha, was the only person who said anything out loud that summer. She'd watched me field these calls for months, watched me hang up looking a little smaller each time, and one night over closing inventory she finally said, "Maren, when's the last time your family actually showed up for you instead of the other way around?" I laughed it off. I told her that wasn't fair, that families help each other in different ways at different times. I believed it when I said it. I'm not sure I believe it now. Todd called that August too, briefly, about nothing in particular. Checking in, he said, though Todd rarely checked in without a reason. He mentioned, almost in passing, that Mom had asked him to sign something related to updating some paperwork for the company, and that he'd signed it without reading it closely because, you know how she gets when you ask too many questions. I laughed along with him at the time. Looking back, I understand now that whatever he'd signed was very likely the first piece of what would become the full restructuring, and neither of us thought to ask each other a single follow-up question about it. By September, the pieces had started accumulating in a way I could no longer fully dismiss. Todd called me again, uncharacteristically, on a Tuesday night. Todd, who lived in Denver and generally treated family drama the way you treat a house fire you don't own, worth watching from a safe distance, not worth stepping into. He was vague, careful, asked if I'd heard anything about the trust restructuring, and when I asked him what he meant, he backpedaled fast, said he probably had it wrong, that I should just ask Mom directly. I did ask Mom directly, that same week. She told me the trust was being modernized ahead of the merger, that Neil was handling all the paperwork, that I shouldn't worry about it. Something in her voice, a specific over-smoothness, made me want to ask a second question. I didn't ask it. I told myself I trusted her. I've thought about that unasked question more than almost anything else in this story. Neil's evasiveness deepened that month. I finally cornered him by phone about the small property matter I'd been asking about for weeks, and he gave me an answer that was technically responsive and somehow told me nothing at all, the kind of answer I recognized only in hindsight, that a good lawyer gives when he's protecting a client's interests at the direct expense of yours. I noticed the practiced smoothness of it. I filed it away as Neil being professionally cautious, the way he'd always been. I did not yet let myself consider that professional caution and personal betrayal can look identical from the outside. Kendall, meanwhile, had started avoiding certain topics with a precision that felt, in retrospect, coached. Any time I mentioned the merger, or the trust, or asked how Grant's family felt about marrying into Wexler, she'd pivot smoothly to wedding logistics, a caterer decision, a dress fitting, with a speed that should have told me more than it did. Once, Helping her address invitations, I asked outright whether the merger changed anything for us kids, meaning the three of us, and she went very still for a half second before saying, breezily, that she really didn't understand all the financial details. That was Mom and Neil's department. I remember thinking her stillness lasted a beat too long for someone who genuinely didn't know anything. I noticed it. I let it go, the way I let everything go that year, because Kendall was my sister, and sisters don't build entire betrayals out of seating charts and caterer decisions. Some of you already know this feeling. The one where you keep collecting small, wrong-shaped details and keep deciding, every single time, that the shape doesn't actually matter. I was collecting them that September the way you collect anything you're not ready to add up: Todd's odd call, Neil's evasiveness, my mother's over-smooth reassurance, Kendall's practice pivots, each one small enough to dismiss on its own, together forming a shape I refused to look at directly. I noticed, too, a change in Aunt Denise that fall, my mother's younger sister, normally warm and talkative at every family gathering, who had gone strangely careful around me at a birthday dinner in late September. She kept looking at me like she was deciding something, and once, when my mother left the table, she opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again and asked me instead how the restaurant rebuild was coming along. I didn't push her. I've thought since about that unasked question almost as much as the ones I never asked my mother directly. My restaurant's rebuild finished in late September, over budget, funded mostly by a personal loan I took out myself rather than ask my family for help a second time. I remember standing in the newly rebuilt kitchen the week before I flew out for the wedding, exhausted, financially stretched thinner than I'd let myself admit even to Sasha, thinking that once the wedding was over, once things settled, I'd finally have the bandwidth to ask my mother the harder questions I'd been avoiding all year. I flew to Georgia 3 days before the wedding with that plan fully intact. I did not yet know that my mother had already made every decision that mattered, that the modernizing of the trust had been finalized weeks earlier, that the envelope with my name struck through it was already sitting, sealed, in a drawer in her house, waiting for the moment she'd chosen months in advance to make it public. The night before the wedding, unable to sleep in my mother's guest room, I went looking for a stapler in what used to be my father's study, now Diane's home office, still smelling faintly, 6 years after his death, of the pipe tobacco he never actually smoked but somehow always carried the ghost of on his sweaters. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. I was looking for office supplies at 11 at night because Poppy needed a poster fixed for a school project she'd brought along, and I ended up, instead, standing over an open desk drawer that wasn't fully closed, looking at a folder labeled, in my mother's handwriting, Wexler Trust, Final. I shouldn't have opened it. I did anyway. Inside was a restructuring document, dated 3 months earlier, reallocating the trust's controlling shares in a way that named Kendall as primary beneficiary and successor trustee, with Todd receiving a modest fixed distribution, and my own name appearing exactly once, in a single clause, terminating my beneficiary status entirely, citing prior distributions already received, a reference, I understood with a cold drop in my stomach, to the business loan I'd co-signed 8 years earlier. The loan I'd always understood as a shared family investment, not a disqualifying withdrawal against my inheritance. Underneath that document was something else, older, in my father's handwriting, dated the year before he died, a handwritten codicil, and signed by a notary but signed by him, expressing his wish that the lake house on Lake Burton be left specifically to me, along with forgiveness of what he called, in his own words, the loan Maren never should have had to take in the first place, given everything else she's carried for this family without complaint. I read that sentence 4 times. My hands were not steady. I sat down on the floor of my father's old study, holding a document my mother had clearly kept, clearly never acted on, clearly buried alongside the version of the trust that erased me entirely. I did not confront her that night. I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strategy. It was the specific, disorienting shock of understanding, all at once, that my father had tried to protect something from me that my mother had quietly, deliberately, chosen to bury, and that I needed, before I said a single word to anyone, to understand the full shape of what I was looking at. I photographed both documents on my phone, put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, and closed the drawer. If you've ever found proof of something you weren't ready to hold, and put it back exactly where it was so no one would know you'd seen it, you understand exactly the strange, careful stillness I felt walking back to the guest room that night, Poppy's poster still unfixed in my hands. I called Neil the next morning, early, before the wedding day fully began, and asked him directly whether he'd drafted the restructuring document I'd seen. There was a long pause, longer than any of his previous evasions, before he said, quietly, "Maren, I really can't discuss trust matters with you. You're not a current beneficiary." The confirmation in that non-answer landed harder than any direct admission could have. I asked him one more question, whether he knew about my father's codicil. The silence that followed was even longer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, smaller, almost apologetic. "That's a conversation you need to have with your mother." I hung up, understanding that Neil had known about both documents for months, possibly longer, and had chosen, every single time I'd called him that year, to protect my mother's version of events over any obligation he might have owed me. I didn't confront my mother before the ceremony. I told myself the day belonged to Kendall, that whatever this was could wait one more day, and I put my phone away and helped finish the seating chart and walked down the aisle beside my daughter with a folder's worth of buried truth sitting in my chest like a stone I hadn't yet decided what to do with. The toast happened the way it began this story, my mother standing, glass raised, speaking about legacy and continuity, and then, with a smile I'd know anywhere, handing that cream-colored envelope to the officiant, who read it aloud without understanding, I think, exactly what he was reading, a formal announcement that the Wexler family trust had been restructured to reflect the family's evolving future, naming Kendall as successor trustee alongside Grant, effective immediately, with a line read aloud, in front of 140 guests, noting that certain prior beneficiaries have received their full distribution in earlier years and are accordingly not included in this restructuring. I sat very still through all of it. I felt Poppy's hand find mine under the table. I felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet, something closer to the specific vertigo of watching your own erasure be read aloud as a formality. Todd, 3 bourbons deep and clearly unaware his mother intended any of this to become public in this particular way, stood up before I could, his chair scraping loud against the tent floor, and said, too loudly, into a silence that had gone completely brittle, "Are you kidding me? You're doing this here?" Maren didn't get a warning. None of us got a warning except apparently Kendall, who's known for months. The tent went dead silent in a way that made the string lights overhead feel suddenly very bright. My mother's face didn't crack the way I expected. She said, evenly, that this wasn't the time or place, that details could be discussed later, privately, the same careful smoothness she'd used with me all year, except now 140 witnesses had heard exactly enough to understand something significant had just happened. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I said only, "I found Dad's codicil last night. In your study. I know you kept it." I watched something move behind my mother's eyes, not guilt exactly, not yet. Recalculation. She was, even in that moment, trying to find the version of this she could still survive in front of a tent full of guests. Kendall, beside her, went very pale, and said, quietly, to no one and everyone, "I didn't know about the codicil." I swear I didn't know that part. My mother's whole face turned toward her daughter with a flicker of something sharp and unguarded, irritation, maybe, at being contradicted publicly by her own successor trustee, and in that flicker I understood that Kendall had known plenty about the restructuring but perhaps genuinely not about the buried document, which didn't make her innocent, only differently complicit. We moved it inside, to the house. 20 minutes later, my mother, Kendall, Todd, Neil, who'd been at the wedding as a guest and now stood awkwardly near the doorway like a man who understood exactly how badly his silence was about to be examined, and my Aunt Denise, who said nothing at first but stood close enough to me, arm nearly touching mine, that her presence felt like the only wordless support in the room. My mother, once we were inside, didn't collapse and didn't apologize right away. She spoke first, and what came out was not the confession I expected but something closer to a justification, delivered with the same even, practiced tone she used for board meetings. "You left the business," she said. "You took the loan, you built your own thing, and I respected that. I did, but I couldn't keep pretending Wexler owed you the same stake as the children who stayed and built it with me. Kendall married into capital this family desperately needs. That's not punishment, Maren. That's strategy." I didn't argue the strategy. I asked her, instead, the only question that actually mattered to me. Why did you hide Dad's letter? She finally spoke. This is what she told me. Your father wrote that codicil the year before he got sick, in a season when he was sentimental about everything, about you especially, about how much you'd carried without ever once asking for credit. I found it in his desk 2 weeks after the funeral, and I sat with it for months trying to decide what to do. If I honored it, it meant admitting, on paper, that I'd let you shoulder that loan alone for years without ever offering to share the burden the way we should have from the start, and admitting that felt, at the time, like admitting I'd failed you as your mother, which I wasn't ready to do while I was also drowning in grief and trying to hold the company together with your father gone. So I told myself I'd deal with it later. Later became a year, and then 3, and by the time Grant's family came into the picture and this merger became real, I had a company to protect and a daughter marrying into the exact kind of capital that could save it, and somewhere in all that math, honoring your father's wishes stopped feeling like the priority it should always have been. I told Neil to leave the codicil out of the new paperwork. I told myself it was because it was informal, unnotarized, that it wouldn't hold up anyway, and maybe that's even true, legally. But that was never really why I buried it, Maren. I buried it because the version of me who honored it was a version who had to face what she'd let you carry alone for 8 years, and I wasn't brave enough to be her. I was afraid of what it would cost me to look at you and admit I'd taken the easier daughter's love and called it fairness, while I let the harder working one just keep proving herself, year after year, without ever paying down what I actually owed her. I am ashamed of that. I had been ashamed of it for 6 years, in a small, quiet way I never let myself examine too closely, because examining it meant doing something about it, and doing something about it meant admitting, out loud, in front of everyone, exactly what kind of mother I had been. Tonight I didn't even have the courage to tell you privately. I made you find out from a stranger reading a document out loud. I don't have anything that makes that smaller. I just have the truth, finally, and I'm sorry it took you finding it instead of me finally giving it to you. I listened to all of it without interrupting. Neil, standing near the doorway, said quietly, almost to himself, I told her more than once she should tell you before the wedding. I should have told you myself when you called me directly and asked. I chose to protect a client relationship over doing the right thing, and that's on me, not just her. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd get from him that night, and it was, I understood, exactly the kind of half-accountability a man protects his career with, enough honesty to feel clean, not enough to actually cost him anything. Aunt Denise, who had said nothing the entire time, finally spoke, quiet and unhesitating. I knew about the codicil, Maren. Diane told me 2 years ago, in confidence, and I told her then she needed to make it right with you. I should have come to you myself when she didn't. That was never mine to sit on, and I'm sorry I did. Her honesty, offered without being asked, landed differently than anyone else's in that room. It cost her something to say it, and she said it anyway. Kendall, still pale, finally added her own piece. I knew the trust was being restructured in my favor. I didn't ask enough questions about what that meant for you, because some part of me didn't want to know the answer. I let myself believe Mom had already worked it out fairly with you. That was easier than asking. It wasn't the full confession the moment called for, but it was, at least, an honest accounting of her own complicity, a choice not to look, made easier because the not looking benefited her directly. I stood in that room, surrounded by 4 people who had each, in their own way, known some piece of this and chosen silence over honesty, and I understood, with a clarity that didn't feel like relief so much as a kind of grief, that I had spent 20 years being the daughter this family could always count on precisely because I had never once made them account for me in return. I didn't sign anything that night, and I didn't ask for anything either, not the lake house, not a reversal, not an apology tour. I told my mother I needed time, packed Poppy's things the next morning, and flew home to Savannah a full day early, missing the brunch that would have closed out the wedding weekend with the appearance of a family healed and moving forward. I wasn't willing to perform that appearance anymore. The consequences, once they arrived quietly and concretely, the way real consequences tend to. I retained my own attorney within the week, not Neil, obviously, someone entirely outside the family's orbit, and had the handwritten codicil evaluated. It wasn't strong enough on its own to overturn the full restructuring, but it was strong enough, combined with the loan's original terms, to force a renegotiation. My mother, facing the very real threat of a public legal challenge that would have unraveled the Callaway merger's clean narrative right when Grant's family needed stability most. Agreed to a settlement that returned the lake house to me outright and reclassified the old business loan as fully forgiven, retroactive to the year my father died. It wasn't everything the original trust might have given me. It was, finally, something I hadn't had to fight silently and alone to receive. Neil lost something too, plainly, without me needing to say it with any satisfaction. Word moved quickly through Savannah's small professional circles once the story of the wedding got around. Guests talk, and 140 of them had a great deal to talk about, and within 6 months, 2 long-standing clients quietly moved their family estate work to other firms, citing, delicately, concerns about conflicts of interest. He kept his practice. He did not keep the reputation for absolute discretion he'd spent 20 years building, and in a small city, that reputation had been the whole business. My mother lost something too, and I'll say it plainly, without gloating, because gloating was never the point of any of this. She lost the version of herself she'd been most comfortable believing, the fair, clear-eyed matriarch making hard strategic calls for the good of the company, and had to sit, publicly and privately, inside the much less flattering truth that she'd let shame and convenience decide who her daughter's labor was worth. She lost, for a long stretch afterward, my unconditional availability, the calls I used to answer within the hour, the drives I used to make without being asked twice. That loss, more than any settlement, seemed to land on her the hardest, once she understood it was permanent. Kendall and I rebuilt something slower and more honest over the following year, not back to what we'd been, but into something that didn't require either of us to pretend the wedding hadn't happened. She apologized properly, eventually, in a phone call 3 months later, without an audience this time, and I believed it more for the audience's absence. I stopped being the family's automatic fixer that winter, not all at once, but steadily. Sasha noticed before anyone else did, told me, one evening at the restaurant, that I'd started saying no to things I would have absorbed without a second thought a year earlier, and that I seemed, in her words, finally like a person instead of a role. She wasn't wrong. Poppy noticed too, in the smaller way teenagers notice everything without commenting directly. She stopped bracing, the way I realized only afterwards she'd been quietly bracing for years, every time my phone rang with my grandmother's name on the screen. I used part of the settlement to open a second, smaller restaurant that spring, entirely my own, financed without a single dollar or signature from my family, the first thing I'd built in my adult life that owed nothing to anyone's approval or forgiveness. Standing in that new kitchen the week it opened, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand at any point in the 20 years before that wedding, that I had built my entire identity on being indispensable to people who had never once, until they were finally forced to, considered what I was owed in return. I don't know if my mother and I will ever be what we were before. I'm not sure, honestly, that what we were before is something worth returning to. I know the daughter who stood in that tent, feeling Poppy's hand find hers under the table, is not the same woman who stood in her own new kitchen 8 months later, signing a lease with only her own name on it. I think, most days, that I like this version of myself considerably more. I think that's the whole point. The cruelest detail in this story was never the trust itself, it was that the very quality my mother relied on most, my willingness to carry things without complaint, became the evidence she used to justify taking even more from me. Diane's restructuring and Maren's decade of quiet overfunctioning weren't opposing forces, they were the same transaction, viewed from 2 different sides of the same silence, a mother who mistook her daughter's competence for consent, and a daughter who mistook being needed for being valued, until a single buried document made the difference between those 2 things impossible to ignore any longer. Neil's complicity complicates the picture in a way that resists easy villainy. He wasn't protecting a stranger's secret, he was protecting a decades-long professional relationship, and the fact that his caution caused real harm doesn't erase the very human calculation underneath it, which is exactly what makes his half-apology, offered but not fully earned, land the way it does. The real turning point in this story isn't the toast itself, it's the moment, months earlier, when Maren asked her mother directly whether the trust restructuring affected her, heard the over-smooth reassurance, and let the second question die unspoken. That's the last instance of the old pattern, chosen one final time, before the story forces a version of honesty no one in that family had been willing to choose on their own. What lingers longest here isn't a verdict on Diane, though her losses are real and lasting. It's a quieter question about how much of what gets called family loyalty is actually an unspoken agreement that one person will keep giving without ever being asked what fairness might actually require in return, and how much it costs everyone, eventually, when that agreement finally breaks in public instead of being renegotiated in private, long before it needed to reach a wedding tent to be seen clearly. That question is the one I still find myself sitting with, longer after the settlement papers than I expected to. If you've ever been the one your family could always count on, and mistaken that reliability for love, I think you already understand what this story cost me to live through, and what it finally gave back. I used to believe that being indispensable was its own kind of security, that if I just kept showing up, kept fixing, kept carrying, I'd never have to worry about where I stood. I know now that showing up without ever asking what you're owed in return isn't security. It's just a slower, quieter kind of erasure, dressed up as devotion. What still surprises me, months later, isn't that my mother made the choice she made, it's how long I'd been available to have that choice made about me without my knowledge, simply because I'd never once asked the question directly. Maybe you've been the reliable one in something of your own. Maybe you already know exactly how much that reliability can end up costing, long before anyone hands you a document to prove it. If this one landed close to home, tell me one word in the comments. The moment you realized being needed wasn't the same thing as being valued. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Some inheritances aren't about money at all, and I'm grateful you let me say that one out loud here.